Before the housemaid had lit their fire the next day, Marianne, only half-dressed, was writing as fast as a continual flow of tears would permit her. Elinor, roused from her sleep by agitation and sobs, said in a tone of the most considerate gentleness, "Marianne, may I ask—" "No, Elinor," she replied. "Ask nothing. You will soon know all." At breakfast she neither ate nor attempted to eat anything. As this was a favourite meal with Mrs. Jennings, it lasted a considerable time, and they were just setting themselves after it round the common working table when a letter was delivered to Marianne, which she eagerly caught from the servant, and, turning a death-like paleness, instantly ran out of the room. "Upon my word," said Mrs. Jennings, "I never saw a young woman so desperately in love in my life. Pray, when are they to be married?" Elinor replied, "I do assure you that nothing would surprise me more than to hear of their going to be married." "For shame, Miss Dashwood! How can you talk so? Don't we all know that it must be a match?" "Indeed, ma'am," said Elinor very seriously, "you are mistaken." Elinor had no spirits to say more, and hurried away to their room, where, on opening the door, she saw Marianne stretched on the bed, almost choked by grief, one letter in her hand, and 2 or 3 others lying by her. She put all the letters into Elinor's hands, and then, covering her face with her handkerchief, almost screamed with agony. Elinor read as follows. "My dear Madam, I have just had the honour of receiving your letter, for which I beg to return my sincere acknowledgments. I am much concerned to find that there was anything in my behaviour last night that did not meet your approbation. My esteem for your whole family is very sincere, but if I have been so unfortunate as to give rise to a belief of more than I felt or meant to express, I shall reproach myself for not having been more guarded in my professions of that esteem. That I should have ever meant more you will allow to be impossible, when you understand that my affections have long been engaged elsewhere, and it will not be many weeks, I believe, before this engagement is fulfilled. It is with great regret that I obey your commands of returning the letters with which I have been honoured from you, and the lock of hair which you so obligingly bestowed upon me. I am, dear madam, your most obedient humble servant, John Willoughby." With what indignation such a letter as this must be read by Miss Dashwood may be imagined. "I only wish," said Elinor, "there were anything I could do which might be of comfort to you." Marianne could only exclaim, "Oh, Elinor, I am miserable indeed," before her voice was entirely lost in sobs. Elinor could no longer witness this torrent of unresisted grief in silence. "Exert yourself, dear Marianne," she cried. "Think of your mother. Think of her misery while you suffer." "Oh, how easy for those who have no sorrow of their own to talk of exertion! Happy, happy Elinor! You can have no idea of what I suffer." "Do you call me happy, Marianne? Ah, if you knew. And can you believe me to be so while I see you so wretched?" "Forgive me, forgive me," throwing her arms around her sister's neck. "I know you feel for me, but you must be happy. Edward loves you. What, oh, what can do away such happiness as that?" "Many circumstances," said Elinor solemnly. "No, no, no," cried Marianne wildly. "He loves you, and only you. You can have no grief." "I can have no pleasure while I see you in this state." "And you will never see me otherwise. Mine is a misery which nothing can do away." "You must not talk so, Marianne. Think of what you would have suffered if the discovery of his character had been delayed to a later period, if your engagement had carried on for months and months." "Engagement?" cried Marianne. "There has been no engagement." "No engagement? No! He is not so unworthy as you believe him. He has broken no faith with me. But he told you that he loved you. Yes. No. Never absolutely. It was every day implied, but never professedly declared. Yet you wrote to him. Yes? Could that be wrong after all that had passed? Elinor said no more, and turning again to the 3 letters, ran over the contents of all. Berkeley Street, January. How surprised you will be, Willoughby, on receiving this, when you know that I am in town. An opportunity of coming hither, though with Mrs. Jennings, was a temptation we could not resist. I wish you may receive this in time to come here tonight, but I will not depend on it. At any rate, I shall expect you tomorrow. For the present, adieu. M.D. Her second note, which had been written on the morning after the dance at the Middletons, was in these words. I cannot express my disappointment in having missed you the day before yesterday, nor my astonishment in not having received any answer to a note which I sent you above a week ago. I have been expecting to hear from you, and still more to see you every hour of the day. Pray call again as soon as possible, and explain the reason of my having expected this in vain. We were last night at Lady Middleton's, where there was a dance. I have been told that you were asked to be one of the party. But could it be so? I hope very soon to receive your personal assurance of its being otherwise. M.D. The contents of her last note to him were these. What am I to imagine, Willoughby, by your behaviour last night? I was repulsed indeed. I have not yet been able to form any reasonable apology for your behaviour. It would grieve me indeed to be obliged to think ill of you, but if I am to learn that you are not what we have hitherto believed you, that your regard for us all was insincere, let it be told as soon as possible. My feelings are at present in a state of dreadful indecision. If your sentiments are no longer what they were, you will return my notes, and the lock of hair which is in your possession. M.D. Marianne, perceiving that Elinor had finished the letters, observed to her that they contained nothing but what anyone would have written in the same situation. I felt myself, she added, to be as solemnly engaged to him as if the strictest legal covenant had bound us to each other. I can believe it, said Elinor, but unfortunately he did not feel the same. He did feel the same, Elinor. For weeks and weeks he felt it. I know he did. Whatever may have changed him now, I was once as dear to him as my own soul could wish. This lock of hair, which now he can so readily give up, was begged of me with the most earnest supplication. For a moment or two she could say no more, but when this emotion had passed, she added in a firmer tone, Elinor, I must go home. I must go and comfort Mamma. Cannot we be gone tomorrow? Tomorrow, Marianne? Yes. Why should I stay here? I came only for Willoughby's sake, and now who cares for me? Who regards me? It would be impossible to go tomorrow. We owe Mrs. Jennings much more than civility, and civility of the commonest kind must prevent such a hasty removal as that. Mrs. Jennings came immediately to their room on her return. How is she, Miss Dashwood? Poor thing, she looks very bad. No wonder. Aye, it is but too true. He is to be married very soon. A good-for-nothing fellow. I have no patience with him. Mrs. Taylor told me of it half an hour ago, and she was told by a particular friend of Miss Grey herself, else I am sure I should have not believed it. But there is one comfort, my dear Miss Marianne. He is not the only young man in the world worth having, and with your pretty face you will never want admirers. She then went away, walking on tiptoe out of the room. Marianne, to the surprise of her sister, determined on dining with them. When there, though looking most wretchedly, she ate more and was calmer than her sister had expected. Mrs. Jennings treated her with all the indulgent fondness of a parent towards a favourite child on the last day of its holidays, in her endeavours to cure a disappointment in love. As soon, however, as the consciousness of all this was forced by continual repetition on Marianne, she could stay no longer. With a hasty exclamation of misery, and a sign to her sister not to follow her, she directly got up and hurried out of the room.
"Poor soul!" cried Mrs. Jennings as soon as she was gone. "How it grieves me to see her! It is the oddest thing to me that a man should use such a pretty girl so ill. But when there is plenty of money on one side, and next to none on the other, Lord bless you, they care no more about such things."
The lady, then, Miss Grey, I think you called her, is very rich?
£50,000, my dear, and by all accounts it won't come before it's wanted, for they say he is all to pieces. Well, my dear, 'tis a true saying about an ill wind, for it will be all the better for Colonel Brandon. He will have her at last, aye, that he will. I shall spirit up the Colonel as soon as I can, if we can but put Willoughby out of her head.
Aye, if we can do that, ma'am, said Elinor, we shall do very well with or without Colonel Brandon. And then rising, she went away to join Marianne. Colonel Brandon came in while the party were at tea, and by his manner of looking around the room for Marianne, Elinor immediately fancied that he neither expected nor wished to see her there, and, in short, that he was already aware of what occasioned her absence. He shortly afterwards drew a chair close to hers, and inquired after her sister. "Marianne is not well," she said. "She has been indisposed all day, and we have persuaded her to go to bed." "Perhaps, then," he hesitatingly replied, "what I heard this morning may be. There may be more truth in it than I could believe possible at first." "What did you hear?" "That a gentleman, whom I had reason to think... in short, that a man whom I knew to be engaged... But how shall I tell you? If you know it already, as surely you must, I may be spared." "You mean," answered Elinor with forced calmness, "Mr. Willoughby's marriage with Miss Grey? Yes, we do know it all." "And your sister, how did she, Her sufferings have been very severe. Till yesterday, I believe, she never doubted his regard. He has been very deceitful, and in some points there seems to be a hardness of heart about him." "Ah," said Colonel Brandon, "there is indeed. But your sister does not consider it quite as you do. You know her disposition, and may believe how eagerly she would still justify him if she could." He made no answer, and soon afterwards the subject was dropped. From a night of more sleep than she had expected, Marianne awoke the next morning to the same consciousness of misery, in which she had closed her eyes. Elinor encouraged her as much as possible to talk of what she felt, and before breakfast was ready, they had gone through the subject again and again, with the same steady conviction and affectionate counsel on Elinor's side, the same impetuous feelings and varying opinions on Marianne's as before. While the sisters were together in their own room after breakfast, Mrs. Jennings, with a letter in her outstretched hand, entered, saying, "Now, my dear, I bring you something that I am sure will do you good." Marianne heard enough. In one moment her imagination placed before her a letter from Willoughby, full of tenderness and contrition, instantly followed by Willoughby himself rushing eagerly into the room. The work of one moment was destroyed by the next. The handwriting of her mother, never till then unwelcome, was before her. The letter brought little comfort. Willoughby filled every page. Her mother, still confident of their engagement, had such a conviction of their future happiness in each other that Marianne wept with agony through the whole of it. All her impatience to be at home again now returned. Her mother was dearer to her than ever, dearer through the very excess of her mistaken confidence in Willoughby, and she was wildly urgent to be gone. Elinor offered no counsel of her own, except of patience till their mother's wishes could be known, and at length she obtained her sister's consent to wait for that knowledge. Mrs. Jennings left them earlier than usual, went out alone for the rest of the morning. Elinor, with a very heavy heart, aware of the pain she was going to communicate, then sat down to write her mother an account of what had passed. Marianne, who came into the drawing-room on Mrs. Jennings going away, remained fixed at the table where Elinor wrote. In this manner they had continued about 1/4 of an hour, when Marianne, whose nerves could not then bear any sudden noise, was startled by a rap at the door. "Who can this be?" cried Elinor. Marianne moved to the window. "It is Colonel Brandon," she said with vexation. "We are never safe from him." And she retreated to her room. "I met Mrs. Jennings in Bond Street," said he after the first salutation, "and she encouraged me to come on, and I was the more easily encouraged because I thought it probable that I might find you alone, which I was very desirous of doing." "I understand you," said Elinor. "You have something to tell me of Mr. Willoughby that will open his character farther? Your telling it will be the greatest act of friendship that can be shown Marianne. You will find me a very awkward narrator, Miss Dashwood. I hardly know where to begin." He stopped a moment for recollection, and then, with another sigh, went on. "You have probably entirely forgotten a conversation between us one evening at Barton Park, in which I alluded you to a lady I had once known, as resembling in some measure your sister Marianne." "Indeed," answered Elinor, "I have not forgotten it." He looked pleased by this remembrance, and added, "This lady was one of my nearest relations, an orphan from her infancy, and under the guardianship of my father. I cannot remember a time when I did not love Eliza, yet, at 17, she was lost to me forever. She was married against her inclination to my brother. Her fortune was large, and our family estate much encumbered. My brother did not deserve her. He did not even love her. But had her marriage been happy, so young as I then was, a few months must have reconciled me to it. This, however, was not the case. My brother had no regard for her. The consequence of this, upon a mind so young, so lively, so inexperienced as Mrs. Brandon's, was but too natural. She resigned herself at first to all the misery of her situation. But can we wonder that, with such a husband to provoke inconstancy, and without a friend to advise or restrain her, she should fall? "The shock which her marriage had given me," he continued, "was nothing to what I felt when I heard, about 2 years afterwards, of her divorce." He could say no more, and rising hastily, walked for a few moments about the room before proceeding. "It was nearly 3 years after this unhappy period before I returned to England. My first care, when I did arrive, was of course to seek for her, but the search was as fruitless as it was melancholy. At last, however, and after I had been 6 months in England, I did find her. Regard for a former servant of my own, who had since fallen into misfortune, carried me to visit him in a sponging house, where he was confined for debt. And there, in the same house, was my unfortunate sister. So altered, so faded. She was, to all appearance, in the last stage of consumption. Life could do nothing for her, beyond giving time for a better preparation for death. I was with her in her last moments. She left to my care her only child, a little girl, the offspring of her first guilty connection, who was then about 3 years old. But I had no family, no home, and my little Eliza was therefore placed at school. It is now 3 years ago that I removed her from school, to place her under the care of a very respectable woman residing in Dorsetshire. But last February, almost a 12-month back, she suddenly disappeared. I had allowed her, imprudently as since it turned out, to go to Bath with one of her young friends, who was attending her father there for his health. His daughter, with the most obstinate and ill-judged secrecy, would tell nothing, though she certainly knew all. Her father could give no information, for he had been generally confined to the house, while the girls were ranging over town and making what acquaintance they chose. In short, I could learn nothing but that she was gone. All the rest, for 8 long months, was left to conjecture. What I thought, what I feared, may be imagined, and what I suffered too. Good heavens, cried Elinor. Could it be? Could Willoughby? The first news that reached me of her, he continued, came in a letter from herself last October, and this was the reason of my leaving Barton so suddenly, which I believe gave offence to some. Little did Mr. Willoughby imagine, I suppose, when his looks censured me for incivility in breaking up the party, that I was called away to the relief of one whom he had made poor and miserable. He had left the girl whose youth and innocence he had seduced in a situation of the utmost distress. He had left her, promising to return. He neither returned, nor wrote, nor relieved her. "This is beyond everything!" exclaimed Elinor. "His character is now before you. Expensive, dissipated, and worse than both. Knowing all this, as I have now known it many weeks, guess what I must have felt on seeing your sister as fond of him as ever, and on being assured that she was to marry him. Guess what I must have felt for all your sakes. My behaviour must have seemed strange to you then, but now you will comprehend it. Use your own discretion in communicating to her what I have told you. You must know best what will be its effect." "Have you," Elinor asked after a short silence, "ever seen Mr. Willoughby since you left him at Barton?" "Yes," he replied gravely. "Once I have. One meeting was unavoidable." Elinor, startled by his manner, looked at him anxiously, saying, "What? Have you met him to—" "I could meet him no other way. Eliza confessed to me, though most reluctantly, the name of her lover, and when he returned to town, we met by appointment, he to defend, I to punish his conduct. We returned unwounded, and the meeting, therefore, never got abroad." Elinor sighed over the fancied necessity of this, but to a man and a soldier she presumed not to censure it. "Is she still in town?" "No. As soon as she recovered from lying in, for I found her near her delivery, I removed her and her child into the country, and there she remains." When the particulars of this conversation were repeated by Miss Dashwood to her sister, as they very soon were, the effect on her was not entirely such as the former had hoped to see. Not that Marianne appeared to distrust the truth of any part of it, for she listened to it all with the most steady and submissive attention. But though this behaviour assured Elinor that the conviction of his guilt was carried home to her mind, she did not see her less wretched. She felt the loss of Willoughby's character yet more heavily than she had felt the loss of his heart. His seduction and desertion of Miss Williams, the misery of that poor girl, and the doubt of what his designs might once have been on herself, preyed altogether so much on her spirits that she could not bring herself to speak of what she felt, even to Elinor. To give the feelings or the language of Mrs. Dashwood on receiving and answering Elinor's letter would be only to give a repetition of what her daughters had already felt and said, of a disappointment hardly less painful than Marianne's, and an indignation even greater than Elinor's. Against the interest of her own individual comfort, Mrs. Dashwood had determined that it would be better for Marianne to be anywhere at that time than at Barton. She recommended it to her daughters, therefore, by all means not to shorten their visit to Mrs. Jennings. She had another reason for wishing her children to remain where they were. A letter from her son-in-law had told her that he and his wife were to be in town before the middle of February, and she judged it right that they should sometimes see their brother. Marianne had promised to be guided by her mother's opinion, and she submitted to it therefore without opposition, though it proved perfectly different from what she wished and expected. But it was a matter of great consolation to her that what brought evil to herself would bring good to her sister, and Elinor, on the other hand, suspecting that it would not be in their power to avoid Edward entirely, comforted herself by thinking that their longer stay would be better for Marianne. Her carefulness in guarding her sister from ever hearing Willoughby's name mentioned was not thrown away. Neither Mrs. Jennings nor Sir John, not even Mrs. Palmer herself, ever spoke of him before her. Elinor wished that the same forbearance could have extended towards herself, but that was impossible, and she was obliged to listen day after day to the indignation of them all. Sir John could have not thought it possible. Mrs. Palmer, in her way, was equally angry. She determined to drop his acquaintance immediately, and she was very thankful that she had never been acquainted with him at all. Lady Middleton expressed her sense of the affair about once every day, or twice, if the subject occurred very often, by saying, "It is very shocking indeed." Colonel Brandon's chief reward for the painful exertion of disclosing past sorrows and present humiliations was given in the pitying eye with which Marianne sometimes observed him. Early in February, within a fortnight from the receipt of Willoughby's letter, Elinor had the painful office of informing her sister that he was married. About this time, the two Miss Steeles, lately arrived in Holborn, presented themselves again before their more grand relations in Conduit and Berkeley Street. Elinor only was sorry to see them. Their presence always gave her pain. "I am sorry we cannot see your sister, Miss Dashwood," said Miss Steele. "I am sorry she is not well," for Marianne had left the room on their arrival. "You are very good. My sister will be equally sorry to miss the pleasure of seeing you." After some opposition, Marianne yielded to her sister's entreaties and consented to go out with her and Mrs. Jennings one morning. She, however, would do no more than accompany them to Gray's in Sackville Street, where Elinor was carrying on a negotiation for the exchange of a few old-fashioned jewels of her mother. On ascending the stairs, the Miss Dashwoods found so many people before them in the room that they were obliged to wait. All that could be done was to sit down at the end of the counter, which seemed to promise the quickest succession. One gentleman only was standing there. Elinor turned her eyes towards his face, and found him with some surprise to be her brother. John Dashwood was really far from being sorry to see his sisters again. It rather gave them satisfaction, and his inquiry after their mother was respectful and attentive. Elinor found that he and Fanny had been in town 2 days. "I wished very much to call upon you yesterday," said he, "but one has always so much to do on first coming to town. But tomorrow, I think, I shall certainly be able to call in Berkeley Street." His visit was duly paid. He came with a pretence at an apology from their sister-in-law for not coming too. But she was so much engaged with her mother that really she had no leisure for going anywhere. His manners to his sisters, though calm, were perfectly kind, to Mrs. Jennings most attentively civil, and on Colonel Brandon's coming in soon after himself, he eyed him with curiosity. After staying with them half an hour, he asked Elinor to walk with him to Conduit Street, and introduce him to Sir John and Lady Middleton. The weather was remarkably fine, and she readily consented. As soon as they were out of the house, his inquiries began. "Who is Colonel Brandon? Is he a man of fortune?" "Yes, he has a very good property in Dorsetshire." "I am glad of it. I think, Elinor, I may congratulate you on the prospect of a very respectable establishment in life." "Me, brother? What do you mean?" "He likes you. I am convinced of it. What is the amount of his fortune?" "I believe 2,000 a year." 2,000 a year. And then, working himself up to a pitch of enthusiastic generosity, he added, "Elinor, I wish with all my heart it were twice as much for your sake." "Indeed, I believe you," replied Elinor, "but I am very sure that Colonel Brandon has not the smallest wish of marrying me." "You are mistaken, Elinor. You are very much mistaken. Your friends are all truly anxious to see you well settled. Fanny particularly, for she has your interest very much at heart, I assure you. And her mother, too, Mrs. Ferrars. I am sure it would give her great pleasure. She said as much the other day. Elinor would not vouchsafe any answer. It would seem remarkable now, he continued, if Fanny should have a brother and I a sister settling at the same time. Is Mr. Edward Ferrars, said Elinor, going to be married? It is not actually settled. His most excellent mother, Mrs. Ferrars, will settle on him 1,000 a year if the match takes place. The lady is the Honourable Miss Morton, only daughter of the late Lord Morton, with £30,000. A very desirable connection on both sides. 1,000 a year is a great deal for a mother to give away, but Mrs. Ferrars has a noble spirit. The other day, as soon as we came to town, aware that money could not be very plenty with us just now, she put into Fanny's hands £200. Your expenses both in town and country must certainly be considerable, but your income is a large one. Not so large, I dare say, as many people suppose. And then I have made a little purchase within this half-year, East Kingham Farm. The land was so very desirable for me in every respect, so immediately adjoining my own property, that I felt it my duty to buy it. Elinor could only smile. Other great and inevitable expenses, too, I have had on first coming to Norland. There is not a stone laid of Fanny's greenhouse, and nothing but the plan of the flower garden marked out. Having now said enough to make his poverty clear, his thoughts took a cheerfuller turn, and he began to congratulate Elinor on having such a friend as Mrs. Jennings. She seems a most valuable woman indeed. Her inviting you to town is certainly a vast thing in your favour, and in all probability when she dies, you will not be forgotten. Do you not think it is more likely that she should leave it to her daughters than to us? Her daughters are both exceedingly well married, and, in my opinion, by her taking so much notice of you, she has given you a sort of claim on her future consideration. Indeed, brother, your anxiety for our welfare and prosperity carries you too far. Why, to be sure, said he, seeming to recollect himself. But, my dear Elinor, what is the matter with Marianne? She is not well. She has had a nervous complaint on her for several weeks. I am sorry for that. At her time of life, anything of an illness destroys the bloom for ever. They were lucky enough to find Lady Middleton at home, and Sir John came in before their visit ended. Abundance of civilities passed on all sides, and Mr. Dashwood went away delighted with both. I shall have a charming account to carry to Fanny, said he as he walked back with his sister. Lady Middleton is really a most elegant woman, and Mrs. Jennings too, an exceeding well-behaved woman. Mrs. John Dashwood had so much confidence in her husband's judgment that she waited the very next day both on Mrs. Jennings and her daughter, and as for Lady Middleton, she found her one of the most charming women in the world. The Dashwoods were so prodigiously delighted with the Middletons that they invited them to dine in Harley Street, where they had taken a very good house for 3 months. Their sisters and Mrs. Jennings were invited likewise, and John Dashwood was careful to secure Colonel Brandon, who, always glad to be where the Miss Dashwoods were, received his eager civilities with pleasure. They were to meet Mrs. Ferrars, but Elinor could not learn whether her sons were to be of the party. The expectation of seeing her, however, was enough to make her interested in the engagement. The interest with which she thus anticipated the party was soon afterwards increased, more powerfully than pleasantly, by her hearing that the Miss Steeles were also to be at it. The important Tuesday came that was to introduce the 2 young ladies to this formidable mother-in-law. "Pity me, dear Miss Dashwood," said Lucy as they walked up the stairs together. "Good gracious, in a moment I shall see the person that all my happiness depends on. This is to be my mother." Elinor assured her, and with great sincerity, that she did pity her. Mrs. Ferrars was a little, thin woman, upright even to formality in her figure, and serious even to sourness in her aspect. She was not a woman of many words, and of the few syllables that did escape her, not one fell to the share of Miss Dashwood, whom she eyed with the spirited determination of disliking her, at all events. Elinor could not now be unhappy by this behaviour. A few months ago it would have hurt her exceedingly, but it was not in Mrs. Ferrars' power to distress her by it now, and the difference of her manners to the Miss Steeles, a difference which seemed purposely made to humble her more, only amused her. Elinor's curiosity to see Mrs. Ferrars was satisfied. She had found in her everything that could tend to make a farther connection between the families undesirable. If she did not bring herself quite to rejoice in Edward's being fettered to Lucy, she determined that had Lucy been more amiable, she ought to have rejoiced. Next morning, at her particular desire, Lady Middleton set Lucy down in Berkeley Street on the chance of seeing Elinor alone, to tell her how happy she was.
"My dear friend," cried Lucy as soon as they were by themselves, "I came to talk to you of my happiness. Could anything be so flattering as Mrs. Ferrars' way of treating me yesterday?"
"She certainly was very civil to you."
"Civil? Did you see nothing but only civility?"
"Undoubtedly, if they had known of your engagement," she said, "nothing could be more flattering in their treatment of you, but as that was not the case—"
"I guessed you would say so," replied Lucy quickly, "but there was not reason in the world why Mrs. Ferrars should seem to like me if she did not."
Elinor was prevented from making a reply by the doors being thrown open, the servants announcing Mr. Ferrars, and Edward's immediately walking in. It was a very awkward moment, and the countenance of each showed that it was so. Edward seemed to have as great an inclination to walk out of the room again as to advance further into it. The ladies recovered themselves first. It was not Lucy's business to put herself forward, and the appearance of secrecy must still be kept up. Elinor had more to do. She would not allow the presence of Lucy, nor the consciousness of some injustice towards herself, to deter her from saying that she was happy to see him. Lucy, with a demure and settled air, seemed determined to make no contribution to the comfort of the others, and would not say a word, and almost everything that was said proceeded from Elinor. Her exertions did not stop here, for she soon afterwards felt herself so heroically disposed as to determine, under pretence of fetching Marianne, to leave the others by themselves. Marianne's pleasure in seeing him was like every other of her feelings, strong in itself and strongly spoken.
"Dear Edward," she cried, "this is a moment of great happiness."
Edward tried to return her kindness as it deserved, but before such witnesses he dared not say half what he really felt. Again they all sat down, and for a moment or two all were silent. Edward was the first to speak, and it was to notice Marianne's altered looks.
"Oh, don't think of me," she replied with spirited earnestness, though her eyes were filled with tears as she spoke. "Don't think of my health. Elinor is well, you see. That must be enough for both of us."
This remark was not calculated to make Edward or Elinor more easy, nor to conciliate the goodwill of Lucy, who looked up at Marianne with no very benign expression. "Do you like London?" said Edward, willing to say anything that might introduce another subject.
"Not at all. I expected much pleasure in it, but I have found none. The sight of you, Edward, is the only comfort it has afforded. We spent such a day, Edward, in Harley Street yesterday, so dull, so wretchedly dull. But why were you not there, Edward? Why did you not come?"
"I was engaged elsewhere."
"Engaged? But what was that when there were such friends to be met?" "Perhaps, Miss Marianne," cried Lucy, "you think young men never stand upon engagements."
Elinor was very angry, but Marianne calmly replied,
"I am sure that conscience only kept Edward from Harley Street. He is the most incapable of being selfish of anybody I ever saw. Edward, it is so, and I will say it." "What? Are you never to hear yourself praised? Then you must be no friend of mine, for those who will accept of my love and esteem must submit to my open commendation."
The nature of her commendation in the present case, however, happened to be particularly ill-suited to the feelings of 2/3 of her auditors, and Edward very soon got up to go away.
"Going so soon?" said Marianne. "My dear Edward, this must not be."
And drawing him a little aside, she whispered that Lucy could not stay much longer. But even this encouragement failed, for he would go, and Lucy, who would have outstayed him had his visit lasted 2 hours, soon afterwards went away. I come now to the relation of a misfortune, which about this time befell upon Mrs. John Dashwood. It so happened that while her 2 sisters were with Mrs. Jennings calling on her in Harley Street, another of her acquaintance, Mrs. Denison, had dropped in. On merely hearing the name of the Miss Dashwoods, and understanding them to be Mr. Dashwood's sisters, she immediately concluded them to be staying in Harley Street. And this misconstruction produced within a day or 2 cards of invitation for them, as well as their brother and sister, to a small musical party at her house. The consequence of which was that Mrs. John Dashwood was obliged to send her carriage for the Miss Dashwoods, and what was worse, treat them with attention. The events of the evening were not very remarkable. As Elinor was neither musical nor affecting to be so, she made no scruple of turning away her eyes from the grand pianoforte whenever it suited her. In one of these excursive glances, she perceived a young man speaking familiarly to her brother. They both came towards her, and Mr. Dashwood introduced him to her as Mr. Robert Ferrars. He addressed her with easy civility, and twisted his head into a bow which assured her that he was exactly the coxcomb she had heard him described to be by Lucy. Happy had it been for her if her regard for Edward had depended less on his own merits than on the merit of his nearest relations. But while she wondered at the difference of the 2 young men, she did not find that the emptiness and conceit of the one put her at all out of charity with the modesty and worth of the other.
"You reside in Devonshire, I think," he said, "in a cottage near Dawlish?"
Elinor set him right as to its situation, and it seemed rather surprising to him that anybody could live in Devonshire without living near Dawlish. He bestowed his hearty approbation, however, on their species of house.
"For my part," said he, "I am excessively fond of a cottage. There is always so much more comfort, so much elegance about them. If people do but know how to set about it, every comfort may be as well enjoyed in a cottage as in the most spacious dwelling."
Elinor agreed to it all, for she did not think he deserved the compliment of rational opposition. As John Dashwood had no more pleasure in music than his eldest sister, his mind was equally at liberty to fix on anything else, and the consideration of Mrs. Denison's mistake in supposing his sisters their guests had suggested the propriety of their being invited to become such while Mrs. Jennings was away from home. Fanny was startled at the proposal.
"I do not see how it can be done," said she, "without affronting Lady Middleton. They are Lady Middleton's visitors. How can I ask them away from her?"
Her husband, but with great humility, did not see the force of her objection. Fanny paused a moment, and then with fresh vigour said,
"My love, I would ask them with all my heart if it was in my power, but I had just settled within myself to ask the Miss Steeles to spend a few days with us. We can ask your sisters some other year, you know."
Mr. Dashwood was convinced. He saw the necessity of inviting the Miss Steeles immediately, and his conscience was pacified by the resolution of inviting his sisters another year. Fanny, rejoicing in her escape, wrote the next morning to Lucy to request her company and her sisters for some days in Harley Street as soon as Lady Middleton could spare them. This was enough to make Lucy reasonably happy. Such an opportunity of being with Edward and his family was, above all things, the most material to her interest, and such an invitation the most gratifying to her feelings. When the note was shown to Elinor, as it was within 10 minutes after its arrival, it gave her, for the first time, some share in the expectations of Lucy. for such a mark of uncommon kindness, vouchsafed on so short an acquaintance, seemed to declare that the goodwill towards her arose from something more than merely malice against herself, and might be brought, by time and address, to do everything that Lucy wished. The Miss Steeles removed to Harley Street, and Sir John, who called on them more than once, brought home such accounts of the favour that they were in as must be universally striking. One morning, some days later, Mrs. Jennings, on returning from a visit to Mrs. Palmer, entered the drawing-room where Elinor was sitting by herself, with an air of hurrying importance.
"Lord, my dear Miss Dashwood, have you heard the news?"
"No, ma'am. What is it?"
"The long and the short of the matter, by all I can learn, seems to be this. Mr. Edward Ferrars, the very young man I used to joke with you about, has been engaged above this 12-month to my cousin Lucy. It was kept a great secret, for fear of Mrs. Ferrars, and neither she nor your young brother or sister suspected a word of the matter. Your sister had just been saying to your brother only 5 minutes before that she thought to make a match between Edward and some lord's daughter or other, I forget who, so you may think what a blow it was to all her pride. She fell into violent hysterics immediately, and a terrible scene took place. For Lucy was to come to them that time, little dreaming what was going on. I declare I have no patience with your sister. What a taking poor Mr. Edward will be in when he hears of it. To have his love used so scornfully. There is no reason on earth why Mr. Edward and Lucy should not marry, for I am sure Mrs. Ferrars may afford to do very well by her son."
Here Mrs. Jennings ceased, and Elinor had time to collect her thoughts. What Mrs. Ferrars would say and do, though there could be no doubt of its nature, she was anxious to hear, and still more anxious to know how Edward would conduct himself. For him she felt much compassion. For Lucy, very little. For the rest of the party, none at all. Elinor soon saw the necessity of preparing Marianne for its discussion. No time was to be lost in undeceiving her, in making her acquainted with the real truth. But unwelcome as such a task must be, it was necessary to be done, and Elinor therefore hastened to perform it. She was very far from wishing to dwell on her own feelings, or to represent herself as suffering much. Her narration was clear and simple, and though it could not be given without emotion, it was not accompanied by violent agitation, nor impetuous grief. That belonged rather to the hearer, for Marianne listened with horror, and cried excessively. The first question on her side was,
"How long has this been known to you, Elinor? Has he written to you?"
"I have known it these 4 months. When Lucy first came to Barton Park last November, she told me in confidence of her engagement." At these words, Marianne's eyes expressed the astonishment which her lips could not utter. After a pause of wonder, she exclaimed, "4 months! Have you known of this 4 months?" Elinor confirmed it. "What? While attending me in all my misery, has this been on your heart? And I have reproached you for being happy." "It was not fit that you should then know how much I was the reverse."
4 months, cried Marianne again. So calm, so cheerful. How have you been supported?
"By feeling that I was doing my duty."
4 months! And yet you loved him?
"Yes, but I did not love only him. I would not have you suffer on my account. I acquit Edward of all essential misconduct. I wish him very happy."
"If such is your way of thinking," said Marianne, "if the loss of what is most valued is so easily to be made up by something else, your resolution is, perhaps, a little less to be wondered at."
"I understand you. You do not suppose that I have ever felt much?"
For 4 months, Marianne, I have had all this hanging on my mind, without being at liberty to speak of it to a single creature. I have known myself to be divided from Edward for ever. Nothing has proved him unworthy, nor has anything declared him indifferent to me. I have had to contend against the unkindness of his sister and the insolence of his mother, and have suffered the punishment of an attachment without enjoying its advantages. If you can think me capable of ever feeling, surely you may suppose that I have suffered now. No, Marianne, if I had not been bound to silence, perhaps nothing could have kept me from openly showing that I was very unhappy.
Marianne was quite subdued.
Oh, Elinor, she cried, you have made me hate myself forever. How barbarous I have been to you. You, who have seemed to be only suffering for me.
The tenderest caresses followed this confession. Marianne engaged never to speak of the affair to anyone with the least appearance of bitterness. She performed her promise of being discreet to admiration. The next morning brought a farther trial of it in a visit from their brother.
You have heard, I suppose, said he with great solemnity, as soon as he was seated, of the very shocking discovery that took place under our roof yesterday.
They all looked their assent.
Your sister, he continued, has suffered dreadfully. Mrs. Ferrars too, poor Fanny. She has borne it all with the fortitude of an angel. She says she shall never think well of anybody again, and one cannot wonder at it after being so deceived. She had asked these young women to her house merely because she thought they deserved some attention, and now to be so rewarded. I wish with all my heart, said poor Fanny in her affectionate way, that we had asked your sisters instead of them.
Here he stopped to be thanked, which being done, he went on.
What poor Mrs. Ferrars suffered, when Fanny first broke it to her, is not to be described. She was quite in agony, and at last she determined to send for Edward. He came, but I am sorry to relate what ensued. All that Mrs. Ferrars could say to make him put an end to the engagement, assisted too, as you may well suppose, by my arguments and Fanny's entreaties, was of no avail. I never thought Edward so stubborn. His mother explained to him if he still persisted in this low connection, certain penury must attend the match. His own £2,000, she protested, should be his all. She would never see him again. Here Marianne, in an ecstasy of indignation, cried, Gracious God! Can this be possible? Well may you wonder, Marianne, replied her brother. Your exclamation is very natural.
Marianne was going to retort, but she remembered her promises and forbore.
All this, however, he continued, was urged in vain. Edward said very little, but what he did say was in the most determined manner. Nothing should prevail on him to give up his engagement, cost him what it might.
Elinor's heart wrung for the feelings of Edward.
Well, sir, said Mrs. Jennings, and how did it end?
Edward is dismissed for ever from his mother's notice. He left her house yesterday, but where he is gone, or whether he is still in town, I do not know, for we, of course, can make no inquiry.
Poor young man, cried Mrs. Jennings. I am sure he should be very welcome to bed and board at my house, and so I would tell him if I could see him.
Elinor's heart thanked her for such kindness towards Edward. There is one thing more preparing against him, added John Dashwood, which must be worse than all. His mother has determined, with a very natural kind of spirit, to settle that estate upon Robert immediately, which might have been Edward's, on proper conditions.
Well, said Mrs. Jennings, that is her revenge.
The third day succeeding their knowledge of the particulars was so fine, so beautiful a Sunday as to draw many to Kensington Gardens. Mrs. Jennings and Elinor were of the number, but Marianne, who knew that the Willoughbys were again in town, chose rather to stay at home. Soon after they entered the gardens, Elinor found herself with some surprise accosted by Miss Steele, who, though looking rather shy, expressed great satisfaction in meeting them. "I am so glad to see you," said Miss Steele, taking her familiarly by the arm and then lowering her voice. "I suppose Mrs. Jennings has heard all about it. Is she angry?" "Not at all, I believe, with you." "That is a good thing. And Lady Middleton, is she angry?" "I cannot suppose it possible that she should." "I am monstrous glad of it. Good gracious, I have had such a time of it. I never saw Lucy in such a rage in my life. When Edward did not come near us for 3 days, I could not tell what to think myself, and I believe in my heart Lucy gave it up all for lost. Once Lucy thought to write to him, but then her spirit rose against that. However, this morning he came, just as we came home from church, and then it all came out. And after thinking it all over again and again, he said it seemed to him as if, now he had no fortune, it would be quite unkind to keep her on to the engagement. But to be sure, Lucy would not give ear to such kind of talking, so she told him directly he should take orders immediately, and they must wait to be married till he got a living. Elinor tried to talk of something else, but Miss Steele could not be kept beyond a couple of minutes from what was uppermost in her mind. "Edward talks of going to Oxford soon," said she, "and as soon as he can light upon a bishop, he will be ordained." Elinor was left in possession of knowledge which might feed her powers of reflection some time, though she had learnt very little more than what had already been foreseen and foreplanned in her own mind. The next morning brought Elinor a letter by the 2-penny post from Lucy herself. It was as follows: Bartlett's Building, March. "I hope, my dear Miss Dashwood, will excuse the liberty I take of writing to her, but I know your friendship for me will make you pleased to hear such a good account of myself and my dear Edward, after all the troubles we have went through lately. We are both quite well now, and as happy as we must be always in one another's love. Our prospects are not very bright, to be sure, but we must wait and hope for the best. He will be ordained shortly, and should it ever be in your power to recommend him to anybody that has a living to bestow, I am sure you will not forget us, and dear Mrs. Jennings, trust she will speak a good word for us too. My paper reminds me to conclude, and begging to be most gratefully and respectfully remembered to her, and to Sir John, and Lady Middleton, and the dear children when you chance to see them, and love to Miss Marianne. I am yours, etc., etc." As soon as Elinor finished it, she performed what she concluded to be the writer's real design by placing it in the hands of Mrs. Jennings, who read it aloud with many comments of satisfaction and praise.